Hello, upgraders, and welcome to another episode of the Upgraded Ape Show. I'm your host, Will Barron, and on today's show we have Steve Fowkes. He's a fellow chemistry graduate like me and is the author and co-author of 6 books, 5 of which are health related. He's also published over 100 issues of 2 health newsletters, and he's a massive source of knowledge for all things smart drugs, nootropics, and nutrients. In today's show, we discuss how simple additions such as B vitamin complexes could actually potentially add up to 10 IQ points to children in less than 1 academic year. And we get onto smart drugs that I've never even heard of. We talk about Steve's experiences with them. This is part 1 of 2 interviews that we're doing with Steve. The second one, we're going to talk about more nanotechnology. This is more the drugs and nutrients side of things. So yeah, I hope you enjoy the show. And if you're listening on iTunes, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a quick review and a quick comment. I check back at them and I get back to everyone who leaves a review, and it means a lot to me and it means a lot to the show and everything else. So yeah, I'd really appreciate it if you could take the time to do that. So without further ado, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Upgraded Ape Show, your daily dose of brain upgrades to help you kick life's ass. And here's your host, Will Barron.
Hi Steve, and welcome to the Upgraded Ape Show.
Thank you. It's going to be fun.
Awesome stuff. Well, let's jump straight in. The first question I want to ask is, there's a lot of hype around supplements and nootropics and different brain upgrades, and I know you're the man that's going to be able to give us some clarity to this and essentially tell us what works and what isn't worth looking at. What are your thoughts on the whole nootropic and supplement scene, just as an overview, and you potentially mentioned the books that you've been involved with as well?
Well, yeah, I was working on the neuroendocrine theory of aging with Ward Dean and Vladimir Dillman when the first Smart Drug book was being done, so I missed that opportunity, but I certainly joined Ward Dean and John Morgenthaler for Smart Drugs 2 and played a major role in the content of that book and felt very good about the quality of that book. Since then, the smart drug scene exploded in the media, got a huge amount of attention. I got a 15 minutes of fame on Larry King Live, and dozens of smart drug books have come out, and it's become kind of a mainstream phenomenon, especially because it's at a foundational level. It involves vitamins and minerals and herbs and amino acids and, simple dietary supplements that are quite accessible to people. So there's no real medical barrier for people to explore this area, even in the United States with pharmaceuticals, because U.S. citizens have permission from the FDA to order drugs from overseas for personal use. So there's a huge amount of information about it and many books that have come out, but it's really the internet that's carrying the bulk of the content. So that's really the place to go to find out about it.
For sure. You may or may not want to answer this, but do you take any specific smart drugs or nutrients yourself?
Oh, absolutely. But, there's a lot of multitasking going on in terms of things. So you can talk about B-complex vitamins simply for their general health benefits, and you can also talk about them as smart drugs. So there's a lot of redundancy in the program. Much of what is done for general health reasons have cognitive stabilizing and enhancing benefits.
Okay, cool. Well, let's look at your top 3 or 4 then. What would you suggest would be the first thing, not to necessarily try, but the first couple of things to investigate for most people?
Well, I would start with B-complex vitamins, and there's a lot of reasons for it. One is it's very, very inexpensive technology. You're talking about 1 to 5 cents a day. If you really get extravagant, you might get beyond 5 cents, but it's difficult. They're just so inexpensive. The second reason is that these are the cofactors for all the enzymes in your brain that control how much energy your brain operates on, the level of neurotransmitters that your brain cells use to communicate with each other, and the detoxification mechanisms that your brain uses to stay clean and run lean. And so it is a lot of potential value there for a large percentage of the people that would be experiencing some kind of mild or age-associated cognitive decline.
And is that because we don't get enough of these in our diets, or is that because of the environment being different to what it has been in the past, for example, and there being more toxins around that needs the detoxification processes?
Well, I think it's both. Certainly, there are good examples of deficiencies in their diet. For example, Schoenthaler and colleagues did a study of California school kids at the same time that Benton and I'm trying to remember the other author did the same parallel study in England with school children, and found that 1/3 of the children had 10-point IQ decreases as a result of poor nutrition. When they repleted those nutrients with a dietary supplement, 1/3 of the kids gained 10 IQ points in less than one academic year. So that's a kind of an amazing finding in and of itself. And because it was done in California and in England, and the researchers weren't communicating with each other, so they both did it independently and came up with exactly the same result, that's really excellent science.
Yeah, that's absolutely mental. That's something that probably most people would be affected by. Most people's diets aren't great, are they, in general?
Right. And with children, you're dealing with more rapid growth than you deal with in adults. And so the nutrition requirements might be different enough that this wouldn't manifest to that degree in adults. But there's also the fact that adults experience a gradual decline in their metabolic rate over time, which, because the brain is using so much energy, and its energy use isn't like the heart muscle where it's only high when you're exercising, when you're pushing yourself. The brain is using high amounts of energy even when it's idling. If you're daydreaming or napping or sleeping, it doesn't matter. Even if the energy difference between daydreaming and problem solving is relatively trivial.
Oh, really? That's really interesting. I would have thought as I guess most people would think that when you're focusing and concentrating, you'd be using up more nutrients and energy.
Well, you are using more, but it's relatively small by comparison because there's so much of the brain's metabolism that is infrastructure. So, like, for example, every 90 seconds, your brain goes from a hyperphosphorylated state to a hypophosphorylated state and then back again. This is a metabolic rhythm that consumes huge amounts of energy and doesn't actually contribute directly to one's thinking and problem-solving abilities. It's a infrastructure stabilizing system that allows the brain to maintain long-term stability in the against issues that would relate to aging and seasonal effects and even circadian rhythm daily effects. So the brain really burns hot all the time. It doesn't really shut down like the heart does. When you take a nap, your heart goes into idling mode. When your brain is idling, it's still consuming most of the same energy that it would if you're problem solving.
Interesting. Well, I want to come back onto sleep a little bit later on. But yeah, have you got a couple more brain hacks or brain upgrades that people can do generally?
Well, I can mention a couple that I've discovered relating to Alzheimer's disease, for example. In studying human brain neurons, there's a remarkable requirement that they have, which is significantly more deep than other animals, and that is that they require pregnenolone or progesterone to be protected. And right now in the United States, both pregnenolone and progesterone are over the counter. So as people age, if their pregnenolone or progesterone levels go down, or they're taking a statin drug, for example, which their doctor, thinks would be good for cholesterol, inhibiting cholesterol, well, these things are derived from cholesterol, and they can get inhibited, and you can end up with cognitive dysfunction. So there's a very easy way to just take some pregnenolone or progesterone for a period of time and see whether or not any neurological symptoms that you might have, peripheral, let's say neuropathy, or central in terms of difficulty in remembering things reliably, or not being able to remember the right word for a particular situation. that you can take those and just see whether or not the problem resolves, which would point to a deficit of neuroprotective investment in your brain. I use Piracetam and Deprenyl as lifestyle drugs. So of the 50 or so things that I take, 2 of them are actually pharmaceuticals.
Interesting. Do you take some kind of choline source with Piracetam? And I'd love to dive a little bit more into Piracetam, with it being the granddaddy of nootropics as well. But do you take a choline source along with that?
I don't. I take B5, which is cholinergic cofactor, but on the whole, I'm dopamine dominant and cholinergic dominant, and so the Piracetam just levels me out in terms of its cholinergic effects. It has a kind of mild anticholinergic mode in me that balances me rather than depletes me. So unless I'm doing Piracetam, heavy doses every day, I don't need any choline supplementation.
Cool. And just for the listeners, so they can do a bit of an experiment themselves, how would they know if they're choline dominant or non-choline dominant?
Well, choline dominant people tend to carry a lot of muscle tension. They're the kind of people who, when they play basketball, can't really determine whether they fouled somebody or not because they're just body blocking themselves all the time. And the muscle that connects the neck to the shoulders, that diagonal muscle right at the top of the shoulders, tends to be tight. And the calf muscle tends to be tight, so they can end up with muscle cramps as a result of their muscle tension. So choline is used to make acetylcholine, which is the brain neurotransmitter, and that operates both in the cerebral cortex, which deals with high-level cognitive functions like intellect and memory, and it operates in the brainstem, which deals with basic motor control stuff. And so there's no real easy way to separate those 2 parts of your brain from a nutrient effect. So you have to kind of compromise. And if you've got high cholinergic tone, if you push your choline too hard, you're going to get headaches and you're going to get muscle cramps, and you have the danger of turning your head to look at something and pulling a muscle in your neck.
Interesting. So if people want to experiment at home, they can take something like Piracetam and they could see if it gives them headaches or on its own can improve memory and focus.
Well, Piracetam won't give you a headache because it'll lower your cholinergic tone. And it might lower it to the point that you'd be missing that cholinergic effect. And so that would be a good investment to do. And if you're interested in brain hacking, would be to take cholinergic support and see how it changes, how you function, how your brain works, how your body works. And then to do, for example, Deprenyl, which would be, a dopaminergic influence, and see how the changing of your dopaminergic tone affects your motivations and your assertiveness and your passion in life. Or serotonin, which would be involved in emotional equanimity and stability, peacefulness, and sleep. Are any of those things aspects of the quality of your life that are important to you? And by playing around with all these things and shifting your mind into different neurotransmitter dominances, can you recognize what you like and what you don't like, such that you can enhance the quality of your life from your perspective and your values?
Okay, cool. Well, let's move on to, you mentioned it before, sleep, because there's something that I want to ask specifically, and that's how melatonin works, if you can give us a brief overview. And there's a lot of people that suggest that regular melatonin use can have a lot of issues and it can downregulate the melatonin that your body's naturally producing. But in smart drugs, it's talked about as anti-aging drug or hormone. Can you just give us your thoughts on either side of that and, as I said, how it works?
I'm of the opinion that melatonin is more for your body rather than for your brain and sleep. That serotonin is what goes through your brain to enhance your sleep, and then the serotonin converts to melatonin, which then spreads from your brain to your body and signals to your body that it's time to heal. It's time to do restorative metabolic processes. Likewise with, for example, growth hormone that would be secreted in the deeper stage 3 and stage 4 phases of sleep. I also do melatonin intermittently. I do tryptophan, which is a serotonin precursor, intermittently. I also do Deprenyl intermittently. I fast intermittently. So I am a big fan of this concept that you don't want to do a steady state approach to managing your health and your well-being, that you need metabolic exercise just like you need physical exercise in order to be healthy.
If you're doing all this intermittently, is there any data points that you personally collect other than just how you're feeling? And is there anything we can physically measure? And I guess it's kind of an odd question because it's difficult to measure how you're thinking and you're feeling. But you know what I mean? How do you know whether something's working or not other than the potential placebo effect?
Yeah. Certainly the subjective side of things is what most people use because, it's not something that you have to deliberately cultivate. You're always paying attention to what's going on around you. But so if you're going to do some cognitive testing to make it objective, you've got to devote some of your time. You've got to change your lifestyle. You've got to play a computer game. You've got to go online to Luminosity or Quantified Mind and play games, play tests, and perform in order to measure how things are going. And so many people really want their cognitive process and their health process to be transparent, to be very, very low profile and minimally intrusive into their life. And they're willing to spend 30 seconds or a minute to take some dietary supplements, but they're not willing to spend 5 minutes doing cognitive testing. So part of that, comes down to whether or not you're inclined to be what would be called a geek or a nerd, where you look at this as kind of a challenge, and therefore you're willing to play those kinds of games. And the other part of it is, can you build a support system within your life, within your social environment, where you can get feedback from people about aspects of your cognitive performance?
Interesting. So that would be, I guess, almost having like a hacking partner and working with them so they could give you feedback and you could give them feedback.
Yeah. So, for example, when I tried Piracetam and did high-dose Piracetam.
And what would be a high dose?
A high dose would be in the realm of, when I started out at that, it was about 7 grams, which
Cool.
is, in the vicinity of maybe 2 to 3 times what an average person would take on a continuous basis. And so it was a loading dose, and it was relatively high, and I noticed effects right away. So I was paying attention to my subjective universe, and I was noticing that writing was easier, then editing was easier. What I didn't notice, that my wife noticed and my coworkers noticed, was that I became multitasking, and it completely slipped by me. But they noticed it because they could now approach me when I'm in the middle of a project where I'm just heavily involved in it, and when they interrupted me to ask me a question or get some feedback on something, when I'm single tasking, that's very intrusive, and I would get ornery, I'd go, and I'd react, and that was a downside for them. And when I took Piracetam, that went away. They could interrupt me, and I was very congenial and happy, and as soon as it was done, they would immediately come back to, I would go back to what I was doing, writing and editing, and I'd still have all the issues in my head about where the segue problems were because I had just moved a paragraph and what part of it I was developing conceptually, and I didn't notice that.
It's amazing, and it's a great story to hear because I've filled around with Piracetam loads now, and the only real effect that I've ever, and you telling that story makes me think that I may have been missing things. The only real effect that I've really noticed is that reds seem really bright and red. I don't know if you've come across that before. I've read it from other people online.
I haven't noticed that, but I've always had a very intense relationship with color from the get-go. I do art as a recreation. I like wearing bright colors. But I did notice that when I took Hydrogene.
What's that?
Hydrogene is a ergoloid mesylate pharmaceutical that has cognitive enhancing properties, and I don't use it on a regular basis. It's hard to get and rather pricey. But when I took it, I noticed a sharpening effect in my vision and an enhancement of color.
Interesting. Well, talking about how difficulty to get hold of things, we're over in the UK, but about 50% of our audience is over in the States. Do you think that a lot of these things we just talked about can potentially stave off neurodegenerative diseases and improve performance in general? Should they be easier to come by rather than importing them from other countries? Do you think that they should be, and I think the words you used at the beginning of the interview were the FDA allows you to do it. Do you think that the FDA shouldn't really have a say in this and you should be able to do what you want with your own body?
Yes, absolutely. The short answer to that question. I'm a firm believer that freedom and autonomy are fundamental human rights, and that people should have that kind of ability to make those kinds of decisions for themselves, particularly when they're as important as this is. I mean, we don't live by our muscles anymore. We live by our brain. And even when we use our muscles, our brain is guiding those muscles in ways that totally involve our effectiveness on the job. And so we are cognitive creatures. And to have something like that be restricted by the government is fundamentally a dangerous thing, like if they were restricting food or restricting water or restricting air. It's that kind of level of importance.
And I totally agree. And I just think as we get older and as the populations in different countries get older, there's just going to be more and more problems that are not solved but can be helped with smart drugs, nootropics, and supplements.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that all the neurodegenerative diseases are pretty much artifacts of civilization, and that by going back to simple nutrition, ancestral Paleolithic kinds of diets, going to whole foods and raw foods, unrefined foods, that most of those degenerative conditions can be significantly affected relatively easily. And even something that is considered as devastating and irreversible as Alzheimer's disease can be most likely reversed fairly readily.
And is there any studies that show that?
Not studies. There have been clinical reports of Alzheimer's reversal all over the place, and there have been a few studies that have been done that have looked at the use of Enbrel, which is a TNF inhibitor, as a anti-inflammatory for Alzheimer's disease. But the clinical work of injecting the Enbrel into the brain wasn't studied. But that's where the phenomenal results are, and people can resolve Alzheimer's disease in a period of 2 weeks, and the fastest that's been done has been 2 hours, where the woman was wheeled in a wheelchair, unresponsive, into the doctor's office, and 2 hours later walked out of the doctor's office talking with her daughter.
What? That seems like it would be all over the news. It would be all over the internet. If you were doing that procedure. Oh, well, okay. I'm heavily invested into the world of the brain, and that's not a story that I've come across.
Yeah. There are multiple reports of this on the internet. That's where I first found out about it. I looked into it. There's also a bunch of really weird stuff out there about it on the internet as well. So the good,
what do you mean weird stuff?
You have to dig for them to find them. But there's even been some news reports on it. And because of this, the company that owns Enbrel actually did a study. But rather than deal with the IRB requirements for doing perispinal injections, sticking a needle through the spine into the brain, they went with just doing the standard injection under the skin, which is how it's used for treating rheumatoid and allergic kinds of conditions, and got marginal results that just didn't work. And that just is pretty obvious that TNF alpha, its inflammatory influence on the brain, is taking place behind the blood-brain barrier, and the Enbrel can't get through it. So you either inject it into the brain or you don't get good results.
And without kind of getting too off track here, but do you believe that there's any kind of conspiracy to hold back these kind of drugs because, neurodegenerative disease drugs potentially are a massive market for pharmaceutical companies?
I mean, certainly it looks that way, but there's a friend of mine has this rule, a law that he operates by, that is never attribute to conspiracy what can be explained by stupidity. And so, just because the FDA is restricting drug access, certainly there's a conspiracy involved in facilitating drugs at the expense of over-the-counter nutrients and generic therapies, drugs that have gone off patent. But that's considered part of the legal process, and it isn't necessarily just a decision of people in the FDA. There's actually laws that say this is how your patents work, and this is how your drug approval works, and that machine is set up in a way that is dysfunctional.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's a good side point. It's something I've not really thought of. You're right there. Well, Steve, we've talked about drugs and upgrading your brain, but there's another side to all this as well, and it's your actual psychology and your mindset. How much of a role do you think, if you put them one side of the scale versus the other, your psychology mindset play versus physically upgrading your brain?
Well, there's no way to know. If you're experiencing some kind of deficit, how do you know whether it's physiological or psychological? And my recommendation is always to start with the physiological because, in my opinion, it's neglected, but to do both because you won't know unless you try it. And if you try a physiological approach and it doesn't work, and you try a psychological process and it does, that means that's where you need to work. And so, both aspects of it need investment. And a lot of people, do, because of the psychiatric industry and the kind of marginal effectiveness of psychotherapy and counseling, do go flip to the opposite extreme, that it's all about physiology. And I've done that myself. I no longer think that it's as skewed as I did think about it. I think it 20 years ago, but the physiological processes of health and mentation are seriously neglected by our medical system and by public access to information.
Mm-hmm. On the mindset and psychology side of things, what did you look at personally? Are there specific books you can recommend to the audience, or is there some other way you went about it?
Well, I had the fabulous experience back when Smart Drugs 1 was being written, of working with Ward Dean and Professor Dr. Vladimir Dillman of the Soviet Union, who was one of these MD, PhD, doctors of science, really a pioneer and a genius. And I had a chance to work with him for 6 weeks while we rewrote a book a bunch of his scientific papers, and put it into a book called The Neuroendocrine Theory of Aging and Degenerative Disease. And so in working with him, not only did I do a lot of the writing and typesetting and setting up the book, but I went through and redid all of his illustrations. So he had all these graphs and charts about neuroendocrine effects and how it worked with insulin resistance and how it fed into cancer and all this stuff that 20 years later would win somebody else the Nobel Prize. And in working with him, I really identified that mental influence on body. That the mind affects the brain, and the brain affects the body, and the brain affects the body by the neuroendocrine system, the hypothalamus and the pituitary and all the endocrine systems, and the mind affects the brain through those brain structures as well. And so we're not just what we eat, and we're not just what we drink. We're also what we think and what we feel and our intuition, all of those kinds of processes that make us human, that are values to us, go into our physiology ultimately.
So that sounds like you're stepping on the toes of kind of spirituality there. Is that kind of right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, clearly. It goes all the way into spirituality and what I would call personal integrity, the integration of your mind and body, the integration of different levels of your mind, your conscious mind with your subconscious mind and your unconscious mind, aspects of emotion and intuition, that this is a lifestyle goal for longevity, to create harmony between all those different aspects of self. And so if you're a vegetarian because the thought of killing an animal is abhorrent, yet your body is a is more of a omnivore, in terms of its basic needs and requirements regarding fat, protein, and let's say nucleic acids, you have a fundamental problem, that this disagreement between your mind and your emotions and your body is going to catch up with you and shorten your life.
I don't know if you have read any Tony Robbins books or seen any of his seminars or anything along the lines of that.
I aware of some of that, and a lot of other spiritual leaders talk about similar kinds of things.
Yeah, because he talks about the concept of and it sounds so simple when you spell it out, but it's something that you don't, or I personally hadn't noticed until I read one of his books. If you wake up and you say, oh, I feel like I'm a really crappy day today, that then is sending different signals and neurotransmitters around your brain, which is going to make you then feel crappy. And then you get on this negative feedback loop.
That's right.
So, and a lot of things we just talked about then with changing your brain chemistry, a lot of it could potentially, I guess, come from the mind in the first place.
Absolutely. Attitude is totally important. Gratitude, appreciation, love, respect, being true to your values. These are all things that feed back positively. And it is true that our expectations create our reality. And so if you think that things are going to be better, they will be better because of that effect. That's basically the basis of the placebo effect. And this is, 30% roughly of the healing potential that would be potentially present in a drug comes from the placebo. And typically drugs that get approved by the FDA operate at maybe 35% effectiveness. So they're only enhancing the benefit of a placebo by a little bit. So why not just do the placebo thing and recognize it's coming from your mind and guide your mind in that process? Deliberately cultivate positive thinking and appreciation and gratitude and optimism. And even though you know that things aren't going to go right all the time, if you have that expectation that they will go right, it's going to go right more of the time. And when it does go wrong, you can just look at that as, okay, this is an alignment tool for me to appreciate when things go right even more.
And do you have any daily practices for being mindful or being grateful?
Sure. I do that every morning and every evening. And as I'm going through life and something wonderful happens, I take seconds to appreciate it.
Amazing stuff. Well, Steve, can we jump into some quick-fire questions and learn a little bit more about you?
Lead away.
First off, are you a morning or an evening person?
Well, I was born an evening person. Waking up in the morning was the hardest time of the day, and I never wanted to go to sleep at night. And so for my childhood, my teen years, my early adult years, it wasn't until about age 40, 45 that I started to focus on the issue of dealing with that, and had a major breakthrough when I started with Piracetam. Not when I did it as I spread it out, but at some point I started experimenting with taking very large doses of Piracetam in a single dose. And when I did that in the morning, boom, the next morning I woke up at dawn without an alarm clock. And this is not in the literature, so of course I had to experiment with it and do it many, many times to believe it. But this has been consistent for me over the last 20 years. Anytime I start to drift into night owl syndrome, the next morning I wake up and take my entire day's dose of Piracetam all at once, before breakfast, and the next morning I'm back to being a morning person.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think it works like that way? Do you think it's setting off something in your circadian rhythm to put it back into sync?
I suspect that what it's doing on some level is accelerating one of the clocks that is just sluggish in me. And I do know that people come in, with 23 and a half hour biological clocks and 25 hour biological clocks. And so this is something that I've studied in looking at urine pH rhythms, acid and alkaline balance, and during the day people become more acidic and their urine starts becoming dramatically acid, typically about pH 5, and then at nighttime their metabolism shifts towards alkaline and their urine will drop down to roughly around 7. And that's a difference of 100 in the amount of protons being excreted. So every 24 hours, you have a 2 orders of magnitude shift in proton balance, in acidity and alkalinity. And this is part of your metabolic rhythm, and it's an indicator of it as well. And I found that I don't acidify early in the morning gracefully, and I tend to stay acid at night. I don't drop into alkaline phases at night. So I've learned to augment my morning with acidifying things and to use alkalinizing things exclusively in the evening. And it's helping me stay adjusted in my circadian rhythm.
What would be a quick example of alkalining or acidifying? Yeah, that's the right word.
Yeah, acidifying would be...
I've got a chemistry degree as well, Steve. That's how good my chemistry degree was.
Yeah, Bulletproof coffee. So you're getting caffeine, which is a thermogenic agent, which is stimulating your mitochondria to pump out energy. That's a very aerobic acidifying effect. And the use of butter and MCT oil in the coffee revs up your metabolism, by providing fat fuel for the mitochondria. So that creates an acidifying trend first thing in the morning. So Bulletproof coffee is the classic kind of thing for me, and would work great if I could tolerate caffeine. But I don't handle caffeine elegantly, so I don't do Bulletproof coffee except as a special treat for myself, maybe 10 or 20 times a year. But in the evening, an alkalinizing influence would be salads and cooked vegetables.
Okay, cool. Well, I think we've shot these quick fire questions with that answer, but it was absolutely fascinating. So we'll jump straight to the final question there, Steve. Oh, no, in fact, I'll ask you one more, and that is, if you could recommend a book to the upgraded audience, other than your own, so we'll come on to that at the end, what would it be?
Well, I don't know that there's really a good book. I mean, I've read books that are good, but most of the books are limited in their scope. In other words, they're dealing with a particular topic, and they handle that topic well, but they're only dealing with 1% of the universe, and therefore, if you're not interested in that topic, the book isn't really relevant. So right now, I'm reading The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz, and I've got on my list next to read Poisons That Heal by Eileen Nauman. And those are, things that I'm looking at and saying, this is what I want to know, and this is what I want to read, and I really like Nina's writing style. She makes things very, very understandable, and I'm reading along going, yep, oh, I didn't know that, and then yep, and oh, that's good to know, and so it's really, I love it. But the real thing that I, recommend to people is tying into the whole hacking universe through the internet. There, podcasts and blogs and chat room groups, and this is where the cutting edge is. This is also new that you really need to, the whole idea of a book as kind of a repository of information is, by the time it comes out, it's already in some level outdated and stagnant. So, use the internet, please.
Fair enough. Well, okay, then what would be a good couple of internet resources that you'd recommend for looking for information to hack your brain?
Well, the first thing that I would recommend would be something like Luminosity or quantifiedmind.com, quantified-mind.com, where you can actually test yourself objectively. This, I think, is the biggest single investment that people can make, because if you're using your brain as the biofeedback tool to judge what's good in your life and what's not good in your life, you're in a sense protecting the thing that makes the most difference. That's a core value And the same kinds of things that keep your body stable, keep your brain stable, and your brain is more sensitive to loss of function than your body is. So it's your best early warning signal, and monitoring your brain from a sleep perspective, for example, is a really great way to do that. So, develop a testing system for yourself. That would be my number one thing to say, that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, that's what you'll appreciate about what you did, is that you started testing yourself.
And totally agree. And I think we're getting to the point now where different organs have been grown in labs from stem cells. Different things have been implanted and transplanted from both animals and humans, and from stem cell growth. But the brain is something that we still don't understand as well as other organs, and it's something that you can't replace, because then you wouldn't be you, would you?
Well, it is constantly being replaced, and so to some extent, you are different than you were a year ago and will be a year from now. And the brain does go through massive rewiring things at age 7 and at puberty and roughly about age 20. So there are these phases, and so we are changing as people. We're not the same as we used to be.
Do you think if we, and we'll wrap it up very shortly, but just there's a final question to you, I guess, and throwing it out there. But if we could relieve a lot of the anti-aging problems with the body, we could start to look at using different drugs and supplements to keep the brain going for longer. Is there a finite length or amount of time that a brain could live for, or doing everything right and having the perfect environment around it, could it go on indefinitely?
Well, that's a good question. And I think that the issues of aging don't necessarily manifest through what ends up taking us down and implementing death. That process is very rarely limited to the brain. The brain seems to be much more stable than the body in terms of the way in which we stabilize our health and well-being. But so it's not that the brain can't fail, and certainly Alzheimer's disease is an example of that, where the death of personality would take place, or degenerative disease like Parkinson's disease. But on the whole, it's the stability of the body that's the issue. And the fact that our systems are as good as they are allows us to live to be 110, 120, 125 years old. If we could hack everything, that would be relatively achievable. But going beyond that, I think would require some kind of major breakthrough in terms of our understanding of how all the many aspects of aging synergize and destabilize each other.
Do you think that before we get to that, we'll get to a point where we can just stick our head into a computer? The point to singularity, is it called?
You mean the download idea, the transhumanism idea?
Yeah, and we're going slightly off topic, but just you must have had thoughts on this.
Well, yeah, and given the way my mind works on an associational level in terms of memory, I can read a paper and not remember who the authors are, but I can remember in the paper a finding about A influencing B, and so that sticks in my mind. But the names of the authors don't. So when I meet people in the street and meet people at church and meet people at meetings, that's the hard time that I have, is remembering their faces connecting to their names. I can look at somebody and go, yeah, I met them before, but the name escapes me. So I'm one of those people who will have this little camera face recognition memory devices that will say, okay, this is this person, so that I can use a tool to fix those deficits that are in the way my brain is structured. But I wouldn't choose to restructure my brain, because I really like having an associational memory. I really like having a systems level view of things. I really like this, the life of being a generalist, where I get to delve in all kinds of pools and let my creativity and curiosity run amok.
And what you just described, which is something that we've all heard about, but I've never thought of it in that manner, in that way, is essentially Google Glass. If that's got some kind of facial recognition, that will give you the person's name, a bit about them.
That's right.
Then that's solved that problem right there, isn't it?
Sure. I mean, so that it's not that difficult a technology, and at some point in the future, having images projected onto your glasses, having a voice talking, having a screen some kind of input directly to your retina. These are all tools that could be developed relatively simply using nanotechnology. And so that's a core interest of mine, facilitating that kind of a future. But the whole idea that somebody can be downloaded, that your personality, your being could be downloaded, I still have various doubts.
Well, cheers for your time today, Steve. You brought up a whole bunch of stuff that I need to go and look at myself now. I'm sure listeners will as well. I'm going to have to do a big write-up of the show. But yeah, thanks again for your time, and thanks for coming on the Upgraded Ape Show.
I told you it would be fun.